do I have to, first question's from Jake. Do I have to write something that's important to me in order to be a good in order for it to be a good or strong essay? Interesting.
That is a good question. And I almost feel like that's one of those, it depends. I would say, and if I could just jump in, I would say it has to be important enough that, this goes for any essay you write or anything you write. It has to be important enough that you're going to want to put the thought and reflection or research or whatever the particular essay takes into it to write it well. But that might depend on the prompt. I don't know. How are you interpreting the question?
Yeah, I think the idea, maybe the classic example, like where you're writing an essay about something that maybe isn't that important to you, is like maybe deep down you're most passionate about art, but you're pursuing engineering, and you're asked to talk about something that isn't important to you. Like some schools, especially a lot of like religious institutions, have this sort of like, how important is faith and spirituality to you? And you may have other reasons that you want to attend the school, so you don't necessarily have the most impassioned reasoning behind that. I think my perspective is like, you can write about something that isn't important to you, but it's going to require a lot more work for that to sound like it, for the reader to believe that it is actually important to you. Right now, I will go ahead and admit that in a couple of my college essays, I was asked variations of this question, whether it's for a major that I didn't want to study or for a value that I didn't particularly share. And I like faked it. But part of doing that is I put way more time into those essays than I did into some of my other ones. And I think I have the advantage that, like, by the time I was writing my college essays, I had been just constantly writing all the time for school, for my extracurricular activities, for jobs that I held outside of school. I had a lot of experience doing that. And so that made it a little bit easier for me. But even for me, those are probably the hardest essays to write, because it's easy to, when you are writing about something that is truly important to you and you're being asked, why is this important to you? It's really easy to come up with the reasons why it's important to you. And B, it's going to sound a lot more authentic. So I'm not saying it is impossible to fake it until you make it, I guess. I'm just saying it is going to make your life a lot harder. And I don't recommend it unless you have a very specific reason that you need to do it. Okay, the next question we have here is from Yay College. So I guess we found Scared for College's evil twin, or just opposite twin. To apply early, what range of SAT score would you recommend? Personally, I have a ton of leadership roles and have done a lot in each of them, but should I exclude some positions to make it seem more focused? I'm on the board of many clubs and I've managed my time, but would it come off as not much dedication? No, that's a really interesting question, actually. Too many leadership positions. I can see why your username is Yay College. No, but in all seriousness, Jake, any perspective on how the student should think about their resume and how they frame stuff? And then as far as the SAT range go, I would say for Stanford, right, it depends a little bit on your background and how you're applying. A student from North Dakota is going to have a bit of a different sort of measurement, or a student from a sort of socioeconomically disadvantaged background might have a slightly different judgment criteria than someone who grew up in a wealthy LA suburb. But broadly speaking, I would say if you're below a 1500, it starts to make your life really hard. If you're above a 1550, that gets into a much more comfortable range where it starts to be about the rest of your application. It's the two guideposts that I like to use generally for Stanford. Sometimes if you're Asian American, just because there's so many Asian American students that apply to Stanford, being even in that 1570, 1580 range starts to matter. But again, it really depends. But yeah, no, this is actually an interesting kind of almost like brain teaser for us in terms of whether she should take some leadership positions off because she's worried about not seeming focused enough. It's kind of interesting.
I would think again, yeah, and I feel like this is what we keep going back to, but it really is so important thinking about your application holistically and what are each of these positions saying about you. Are we getting into too much overlap? Do you have other things on your resume that might show another really interesting side of you, or might show another passion, or might show another strength or skill? And thinking about skills, like sometimes I know we all talk about leadership and how and leadership is important, but think about agility, right? Think about self and social awareness. Think about your ability to do cool things on the internet. I don't know, all of these things that are like also important to schools. And think about how your 10 things on Common App, how are those going to be read between the lines? You're worried that all of these leadership positions might be read as you're flighty, but is it also possible that there is somewhere else that you can put them into context? And we can sometimes use one of the supplementary essays or something to put these to answer questions we might be worried that the reader might have, right? If we're writing a long essay, think about you're writing an argumentative essay, and you're always thinking about what questions or how are people going to be challenging what I'm saying here. And if you're worried that someone might have questions, right, think about maybe one of these essays is one where you can synthesize these leadership positions and talk about how this builds you up. So there are several, I think, options for dealing with that rather than just throwing them away.
First question is from Jennifer. Hi, I'm confused about the discussion of test scores for 2023 students. Stanford's webpage explicitly states that a student will not be disadvantaged if he or she does not submit test scores. So what should I tell my students? It's a great question, Jennifer, and I think it is a tricky one to answer, first, especially for someone in your situation, because what the colleges say isn't necessarily how they actually behave in practice. And so what we have done here at CollegeVine is one of the things that I'm really focused on is making sure that we're using data in ways that help students. And what we've found when we dig into this is that even though the colleges say you will not be disadvantaged without a test score, you pretty much will be disadvantaged without a test score at Stanford. Now, this is not necessarily true at every college, right? It is really what we're talking about here is really the selective sort of Ivies, Stanford, Chicago. MIT is now explicit about it again because they require tests. But broadly speaking, it is a lot harder to get in if you don't have a test than if you do. Not impossible. It is still possible to get in if you're applying test optional. But if you just look at last year's Stanford class, 91% of incoming students had an SAT or an ACT score and applied with it. Okay? And that was in 2021, because that's the last full sort of cycle that we've seen, where when these students were applying in like August and September of last year, we were still coming out of a period where in the spring, at least, there had been substantial testing disruptions. So some proportion of those kids who didn't have an SAT or ACT are probably in the category of, we lived in California and our town was like particularly hard or particularly stringent with COVID lockdown. So we weren't able to take a SAT or ACT before we applied. So I think that from that perspective, it's not impossible, but the data pretty strongly suggests that Stanford is like test optional kind of in name only. And what I can also tell you is that from the data that we're seeing more broadly across Stanford and other similar schools, you hold everything else constant. So the GPA, the course profile, the ECs in our system, and all you vary is one student has a test and one student doesn't. Generally speaking, having a test at these kinds of selected schools is about a doubling or tripling of your chance of admission, all else held equal. In terms of telling your students, I would say that like Stanford says that they're test optional, but you should operate as though they are not, is honestly what I would say, if Stanford is their dream school. Or if your students are not great test takers or struggle with standardized tests or have some challenges that prevent them from being able to score effectively, then I would say there's a lot of great schools that aren't Stanford that are truly test optional, are taking or being true to their word to some extent, right? The next question we have here is from Johnathan. Is it better to list a brand new activity in short answer number 4, or can you detail an activity that you listed in your Common App resume, presumably, in a new way? So I tend to think that it depends. If you've got a resume that maybe has some gaps or maybe doesn't have as many formal accomplishments, then I would go for something on my resume because it's a great way to add depth and texture and make those activities feel more real to the admissions office. I think on the other hand, if you're someone who's got a sort of resume that kind of speaks for itself, which oftentimes a lot of folks who are applying to Stanford have the resumes that have multiple leadership positions and multiple awards and so on and so forth, then sometimes I like going with something that's a little bit lighter or a little bit more unexpected, right? I think like in the context of applying to a place like Stanford, confounding expectations is a great place to start. I couldn't tell you why the light just went out, but it came back on, so we're gonna just move past it.